I tried to get this video up on Wednesday, that didn't work out. I tried to get it up on Thursday, and that really didn't work out. I tried to get it up yesterday, and again, that didn't work out. So today, finally, is my next review of Yu-Gi-Oh! This is Cards with Teeth, the chapter that introduces the Blue Eyes White Dragon and specifically Duel Monsters, the game that would become the main focus of Yu-Gi-Oh! Later on, to the Yu-Gi-Oh! Canon. It's also the first two-part chapter of Yu-Gi-Oh! And that's why I'm going to be reviewing both chapters together, as both chapters cover the action from a single game. In fact, most two-part chapters I will be covering in the same manner. There are a lot of games in Yu-Gi-Oh! That are meant to be XPs or inserts of actual games into Yu-Gi-Oh!'s canon. They're Kazuki Takahashi's own takes on those games, and Duel Monsters, called Magic and Wizards in the Japanese version, is no doubt Takahashi's interpretation of Magic the Gathering. He even has Yugi describe the game as two players in the roles of wizards, summoning monsters and casting spells to defeat each other. Now there are some key differences. Obviously, instead of the monsters having powers in the tens, they have them in the thousands. The same goes for each player's life. It's also measured in the thousands rather than the tens. And there's no mana. There's no cost to do anything. Some cards will have individual costs, but that only came later. And that all stems from the fact that Kazuki Takahashi wanted to make this game fast-paced and interesting, and never really expected it to take off as its own thing. That's why somebody who plays Yu-Gi-Oh! Now in the real world has to keep up with a list of banned cards that were so powerful that the fact that the game doesn't have a basic cost system to play cards allows those cards to break the game, and why more modern cards have more considerable specific and balanced costs that are specific to the cards themselves. I could almost make an entire video on Duel Monsters itself and how I don't think it was the right game to translate over to the real world, at least not in the form that we saw it in the show. But I'm not going to do that today. I'm not going to go off on a tangent and talk about that for 10 or 20 minutes. I'm going to talk about this chapter, I promise. Because regardless of what I think about the real life counterpart of the game, I do love the game. I think it's great. I think the creatures in it are great. I really do like these earlier chapters where they play it. It just so happens that this one time that Yugi and his friends are talking about Duel Monsters at Yugi's grandpa's shop, and the one time that Yugi's grandpa brings out his ultra rare Blue Eyes White Dragon to show them, Seto Kaiba walks in looking for rare cards. He just so happens to see the Blue Eyes White Dragon and offers to trade an entire briefcase full of rare cards for it. At this point in the continuity of the game, Blue Eyes White Dragon has the most attack and defense points that any monster can have. And with a few exceptions in the game now, Blue Eyes White Dragon is still the monster with the highest attack points that can be normal summoned from the player's hand. There are a couple of dinosaur monsters that exceed it, but for some reason the game designers consider dinosaurs an exception. My point is, the Blue Eyes White Dragon is badass. It's one of the coolest creatures in any anime ever. I would argue that until I'm blue in the face. And this is the story of how Seto Kaiba became so obsessed with that card that he built almost his entire identity around it. In fact, in the anime adaptation of Yu-Gi-Oh! Duelist, he even builds a personal jet in the shape of a Blue Eyes White Dragon. And it's awesome. Yugi's grandpa, however, refuses to trade the card. It was given to him by a dear friend, and he now treats that card with the same love and respect that he would his friend. He gives a little speech about how if you treasure something, it grows a heart of its own, but even though that does come into play later, it's eventually retconned that isn't exactly what happened. I'll talk about that in a minute. Kaiba leaves. He's clearly not happy, but he lets it go. However, he goes to Yugi's school. He's in Yugi's class. So later, guessing correctly that Yugi has the card with him, he asks to see it again, and Yugi obliges. At which point, Kaiba switches it for a very realistic-looking proxy that he printed out at home. It doesn't come into play in this story, but Kaiba is actually incredibly wealthy and well-to-do. It's entirely reasonable that he would be able to create an almost perfect facsimile of the card, but Yugi is still able to see through it. And because Yugi is such a good guy, he chooses to confront Kaiba later when there isn't anybody around, and Kaiba lies through his teeth, says he doesn't know anything about it, and basically tells Yugi off for making this accusation. That, combined with the fact that Kaiba smacks Yugi in the face with his briefcase, it's a pretty grave injustice against Yugi, so the other Yugi comes out. He, at some point off-screen, challenges Kaiba to a game of Duel Monsters in some random location. I'm not sure if they ever actually tell us where it is. It's kind of odd. Anyway, we see them sitting together at a table in a dark room, and they start to play the game. This is the very first draft of the Duel Monsters rules. I believe that at some point in these two chapters, they call them the first edition rules, which explains away why the rules continue to change and evolve later on. I don't know if that's something they added for the English version, or if that was always there, if Kazuki Takahashi planned ahead for the possibility that this game might take off and feature in later chapters, and then he might have to update the rules then. But it does cover the bases. At this point, the game only consists of monsters and spells. So no, I activate my trap card, just monsters and spells, and I'm honestly really surprised that it manages to be such an interesting game with just those two elements. We see a lot of cards here that are going to be slightly retconned later on. Their levels are all wrong, their attack and defense are slightly off, but we do get to see the start of some of the most recognizable cards of the early sets of Yu-Gi-Oh! here in this chapter. Ryukushin the Gargoyle, the Battle Ox, Blackland Fire Dragon, Mystical Elf, and of course the Blue Eyes White Dragon. Kaiba does eventually bring it out of his pocket and slip it on top of his deck when he's about to draw, and summons it against Yugi's Summoned Skull, one of my personal favorite monsters. However, this has all been a shadow game. The monsters on the table are actually manifestations of real monsters, the real monsters featured on the cards. And so the Blue Eyes White Dragon, which doesn't belong to Kaiba, which belongs to Yugi's grandfather, refuses to listen to Kaiba's commands. The other Yugi kind of explains that this is because the heart of his grandfather lives in that card because of the respect that his grandfather showed it. But this is the part I talked about as retcon later. Later on we learn that every card has a heart. That when a new Duel Monsters card comes into existence, a corresponding soul belonging to that monster comes into existence in one of the monster realms. So what is very clearly actually happening here based on that later retcon is that the card, the heart of the card, came to appreciate Yugi's grandfather and refused to obey the person who stole it from him. So the Blue Eyes White Dragon effectively self-destructs, and then Yugi is able to use his spell card, Monster Reborn, to bring it back on his side of the field. And that gives him enough power to win the game. At which point, of course, because this was a shadow game, Kaiba is faced with a penalty, the experience of death. However, it's just an illusionary nightmare of monsters attacking him where he's almost guaranteed to experience a nightmare death at least once. No actual harm will come to his body, as I mentioned previously. Whenever he can help it, the other Yugi doesn't kill his opponents. And despite the fact that Kaiba had countless rare cards in his deck, the other Yugi leaves and goes home with only the Blue Eyes White Dragon and the cards he brought himself. I honestly wouldn't be surprised if part of the reason that Yugi chose such a secluded place for their game was specifically so that Kaiba would wake up before anybody found his deck and could steal it. It's really interesting going back and reading this chapter after having read and watched everything else Yu-Gi-Oh! Related over these many, many years. Kaiba looks very different here. He looks about as different from the Kaiba we'll come to know as Yugi and his friends did at the very start of the manga, compared to how they would look later, obviously. And his attitude is completely different. As I said before, there's no mention here of his fortune, suggesting that he probably wasn't supposed to be a recurring villain at this point. And he doesn't have any pride. Kaiba later on will have a lot of pride. Kaiba later on would never steal someone else's card and use it. In fact, he hates people like that. But Kaiba later on, the Kaiba we'll get to know in Duel Monsters, was almost literally a different person from this Kaiba, so it makes sense, and you'll see what I'm talking about later when we get to the second arc involving Kaiba and Duel Monsters. You also may have noticed, any of you who watched the Yu-Gi-Oh! Anime, the one that adapted Duelist, that the beginning of this chapter resembles the beginning of the first episode of that anime. And you're absolutely right. The first episode of that anime was actually an adaptation of the beginning of this chapter and the end of the Death Tea arc, the second arc to feature Kaiba in these first 7 volumes of the manga. It was kind of a 22-minute summary of all the Duel Monsters related material that came before Yu-Gi-Oh! Duelist. So at the end of the day, the most noteworthy things about this chapter are the fact that it introduces so much and serves as an interesting look back at where everything started, and that it is the origin of the Blue Eyes White Dragon, which is pretty freaking awesome. And I often wonder if, at this point, Kazuki Takahashi was leaving the possibility open for the Blue Eyes White Dragon to become Yugi's ace monster, rather than Kaiba's as it is later on, in case Duel Monsters ever featured in the manga again. There's even an image at the very end of the chapter, a little closing image, that shows Yugi holding a hand of cards and showing us one of them, and it's the Blue Eyes White Dragon. If that is the case, I'd really like to sit down with the man, even though I know it'll never happen, and ask him what it is that changed his mind. So while this was certainly a good chapter, it was more remarkable for the things that it would lead to later on than for what it actually brought to the table itself. But if you are a fan of Yu-Gi-Oh! And you've only watched the animes, I would definitely recommend finding this chapter and the chapters that make up the Death Tea arc and reading through those. You'd probably get a lot out of them. That said, guys, what did you think of this chapter of Yu-Gi-Oh! If you have read it? Let's get a discussion going in the comment section down below. Either way, this has been AJ22, and I will talk to you guys later.